They bet against me at work. She did it at home. Section 1. The Quarter. Everything looked normal on paper. The air in the boardroom of Foster & Associates always smelled of expensive mahogany and cold, recycled oxygen. It was a scent I had associated with victory for 12 years, but today it felt like a warning. I sat at the far end of the table, my hands resting flat on the polished surface, watching Julian Foster adjust his cufflinks. He didn't look at me. He looked at Marcus Lane, a man I had personally mentored, who was now sitting in the seat usually reserved for the lead strategist. On paper, I was still the senior portfolio manager, responsible for over $4 billion in assets, but the atmosphere suggested I was already a ghost. My quarterly performance was up by 12%, yet the silence in the room was heavier than any deficit could ever be. I watched Marcus lean forward, his smile a little too wide, a little too rehearsed. He started talking about dynamic restructuring and emerging leadership, buzzwords that meant nothing and everything at the same time. I realized then that the conversation had happened long before I entered the room. It was a subtle shift, a redistribution of influence that didn't require my signature, only my absence. Why was I being bypassed when my numbers were the strongest in the firm? I stayed silent because I needed to see exactly how far they would go without me. I realized that the lack of eye contact wasn't out of disrespect, but out of a very specific, calculated fear of what I might still be capable of doing. That evening, I returned home to a house that felt just as hollow as the boardroom. Claire was in the kitchen, her back to me, scrolling through her phone with a focused intensity that she usually reserved for our anniversary planning. When I spoke, she didn't jump, she simply exhaled, a long, tired sound that suggested my presence was an interruption to a much more interesting internal dialogue. "How was the meeting, Andrew?" she asked, her voice flat and devoid of the curiosity that used to define our evenings. I told her it was standard, even though it was the beginning of an execution. I stayed silent about the details because I wanted to see if she would ask the follow-up questions she always used to ask. She didn't. Instead, Claire mentioned that she had seen Elena Price for lunch and that they were discussing a new investment opportunity for the foundation she managed. It was a foundation I had built for her, funded by my bonuses over a decade of high-stakes trading. She didn't ask for my advice on the investment. She didn't even mention the sector. That was the moment I understood that the wall being built at Foster & Associates had a sister wall being built right here, in my own living room. Was it possible that the two worlds were communicating in ways I hadn't yet mapped out? I watched her pour a glass of wine, her movements precise and detached, as if she were a tenant in a life she no longer intended to occupy. The next morning, I arrived at the office an hour earlier than usual. I wanted to see the digital footprints of the previous day's dynamic shift. As I logged into the terminal, I noticed a series of restricted access alerts on accounts I had managed for years. My credentials hadn't been revoked, but they had been moved to read-only status for the Sinclair Group accounts. Robert Sinclair was my oldest client, a man who valued loyalty above all else. If I was being locked out of his portfolio, it meant someone had told him a story about me that justified my removal. Who had the authority to change the permissions on a senior partner's accounts without a formal compliance review? I sat in the dark office, the blue light of the monitor reflecting off my glasses, and I didn't feel anger. I felt a strange, cold clarity. In finance, when you see a pattern of unusual activity, you don't scream, you hedge. I began to look into the logs, searching for the administrator ID that had authorized the change. It was Julian's ID, but the timestamp was from a time when I knew he was at a charity gala with Claire and Elena. The realization hit me with the force of a market crash. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was systemic. They weren't just taking my job, they were taking my reputation, my clients, and my history, all while I was expected to sit quietly at the dinner table. I stayed silent during the morning briefing, even when Marcus took credit for the hedging strategy I had implemented 3 months ago. I watched Julian nod in approval, his eyes finally meeting mine for a split second, searching for a spark of resentment. I gave him nothing. I gave them both a mask of professional boredom. I realized that if they thought I was oblivious, they would become careless. They needed me to be the tired veteran, so they could be the bold innovators. But as I looked at the flow of capital on my screen, I saw something they had missed. A small, recurring transfer out of the foundation's overhead account into a private LLC I didn't recognize. The LLC was registered under a name that meant nothing to me, Aurelius Holdings. I spent the afternoon tracing its origin, moving through layers of shell companies and offshore filings that were designed to hide the beneficial owner. It was a sophisticated structure, the kind of thing I would have built for a client who wanted to disappear. Who had the expertise to set this up? I realized that Marcus had spent 3 years in the tax-efficient structuring department before I hired him. The pieces were starting to align into a shape that was both ugly and undeniably brilliant. My wife was moving money, and my protégé was providing the vehicle. I went home that night and found a bouquet of lilies on the entryway table. They weren't from me. There was no card, just the flowers, sitting there like a trophy. I asked Claire who they were from, and she gave a small, dismissive shrug, saying they were a thank you from a gallery she had helped. I looked at the lilies and saw a message. In the language of the circles we ran in, lilies were often used to signify a transition. Was she mourning our marriage, or was she celebrating its end? I realized that I was living in a house full of secrets, surrounded by people who were waiting for me to fail so they could inherit the ruins. Before I went to bed, I checked my personal brokerage account. It was the only thing they couldn't touch, or so I thought. I saw a notification for a password reset request that had been denied because of my two-factor authentication. Someone was trying to get in. Someone was getting desperate to see exactly how much leverage I still had. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the sound of Claire's steady breathing in the next room, and I made a decision. I wouldn't fight them for what they were trying to steal. I would let them take it, but I would make sure that what they inherited was a liability they weren't prepared to manage. The question was, how much did they already know? Section 2. I noticed money, moving without explanation. The following week, the silence at the office grew louder. People who used to stop by my desk for a quick opinion on the Nikkei or the bond yield curve now found reasons to look at their phones as they passed. It was a classic corporate ghosting, a psychological tactic designed to make the target quit out of sheer isolation. I didn't quit. I arrived at 7:30 a.m. and left at 6:30 p.m., maintaining a perfect record of presence while my actual responsibilities were being stripped away like bark from a dying tree. I realized that Julian was waiting for a confrontation, a scene he could use to justify a for-cause termination. I stayed silent because my silence was the only thing he couldn't control. I began to keep a separate ledger, not of the firm's money, but of the anomalies. I noticed that several high-net-worth clients were being moved into a new elite strategy fund managed by Marcus Lane. This fund had a fee structure that was predatory, yet the clients were signing on without hesitation. How were they being convinced? I realized that Marcus was using my proprietary data, my life's work, to project returns that were impossible to sustain. He was selling them a dream built on my research, but he was stripping away the risk management protocols I had developed. He was building a house of cards, and he was using my name as the foundation. At home, the anomalies were smaller but equally telling. A charge for a high-end restaurant in a part of the city Claire never visited. A sudden change in her phone's privacy settings. A new set of keys on the hook that she claimed were for Elena's guest house. I realized that the betrayal was no longer a theory, it was an operational reality. I stayed silent because I needed to know the why before I addressed the what. Was it just greed? Or was there a deeper resentment I had missed during the years I spent building our wealth? I began to observe Claire with the same analytical detachment I used for distressed debt acquisition. One evening, I stayed late at the office under the guise of finishing a compliance report. In reality, I was monitoring the internal server traffic. I saw a massive data transfer initiated from my terminal ID while I was supposedly at lunch. It was a download of my entire client contact list and 20 years of historical trade data. I realized that they weren't just sidelining me, they were harvesting me. They were preparing to move the entire business to a new entity, leaving me with a title and an empty shell of a firm. But as I watched the progress bar, I noticed a flaw in their plan. They were using a mirror site that I had helped design for disaster recovery. I realized that if I could access the mirror site, I could see exactly where the data was being sent. It wasn't just going to a new server. It was being sent to an IP address registered to Aurelius Holdings, the same LLC that Claire was funding through the foundation. The synergy was terrifyingly efficient. Marcus was the architect, Julian was the muscle, and Claire was the silent partner, providing the capital they needed to launch their new venture. I felt a cold chill settle in my chest. It wasn't the loss of the money that hurt. It was the realization that they thought I was too weak or too blind to see the pattern. I decided to test the boundaries of their deception. At dinner that night, I casually mentioned that I was thinking of taking a sabbatical, perhaps a month in the mountains to reconnect. I watched Claire's hand pause for a fraction of a second as she reached for the salt. "That sounds like a wonderful idea, Andrew," she said, her voice a bit too bright. "You've been so stressed lately, you deserve a break." I realized that my absence was exactly what they needed to finalize the transfer of assets. They wanted me gone, not just from the office, but from the narrative. They needed the broken man to disappear so the winners could take the stage. The next day, I contacted Robert Sinclair. I didn't tell him about the betrayal. Instead, I asked him for a personal favor, a private audit of his accounts, citing internal restructuring. Robert, ever the shark, sensed the tension. "Andrew," he said over the phone, his voice like gravel, "are you telling me my money is at risk, or are you telling me you are?" I stayed silent for a moment, letting the weight of the question hang in the air. "I'm telling you that I'm restructuring my risk, Robert. I'd like you to be a part of the new strategy." I realized that by moving first, I could create a firewall around the clients who actually mattered. Back at the office, Julian called me into his room. He was sitting behind his desk, flanked by Marcus, who looked like a kid who had just been given the keys to a Ferrari. "Andrew," Julian began, his tone paternalistic and fake, "we've been looking at the long-term direction of the firm. We think it's time for you to transition into an advisory role. Less day-to-day, more big-picture stuff. It was the corporate version of being put out to pasture. I realized that this was the moment they expected me to break. They expected a plea for my legacy or a flash of anger that they could document. I simply nodded. "I understand," I said. "What's the timeline?" The look of confusion on Marcus's face was worth more than any bonus I had ever received. He had expected a fight. He had prepared for a war. By surrendering so easily, I had deprived him of the friction he needed to justify his next move. I realized that they were so focused on the assets they were stealing that they hadn't considered the liabilities they were assuming. If I was no longer the senior partner, I was no longer responsible for the adjustments Marcus had been making to the risk models. I stayed silent because I knew that the moment I walked out of that room, the legal clock began to tick on their new venture. As I left the office that day, I saw Elena Price sitting in the lobby, waiting for someone. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and something else, perhaps guilt. She was Claire's best friend, the one who had likely facilitated the meetings between my wife and my protégé. I walked past her with a polite nod, not stopping to chat. I realized that the web was much larger than I had initially thought, involving social circles, professional ties, and personal loyalties. But a web is only strong until the center is removed. I went to my car and sat there for a long time, watching the sun set over the city. I had found the leak. Now I had to decide when to stop the flow. Section 3. Affection feels different when respect is missing. The silence in our bedroom had become a tactical environment. Claire was sitting at her vanity, removing her jewelry with a rhythmic clicking sound that echoed like a countdown. I watched her through the reflection in the mirror, noticing how she avoided my eyes even in the glass. She was wearing a new necklace, a delicate gold chain with a teardrop diamond that I hadn't purchased. I realized that the gifts were no longer coming from me, yet she wore them in my presence as if testing the limits of my observation. I stayed silent because I wanted to see if she would offer a lie. When she didn't, I understood that she had already moved on to the next phase of her life. I was merely a logistical hurdle she had to tolerate until the paperwork was finalized. That was the moment I understood that our marriage hadn't failed. It had been liquidated. She was treating our history like a depreciated asset, something to be written off to make room for a higher yield investment. "You've been very quiet lately, Andrew," she said, her voice trailing off as she applied her night cream. I told her I was thinking about the future, which was true, though she assumed I meant a future of defeat. I realized that she viewed my restraint as weakness, a sign that I had finally been broken by the pressure at the firm. She didn't realize that I was simply waiting for the market to move into the position I had predicted. I stayed silent because every word I spoke was a potential data leak, and I was now running a closed system. The next morning, I went to a small, nondescript office in the suburbs, far from the glass towers of the financial district. I was meeting Robert Sinclair's personal attorney, a man who specialized in uncoupling complex financial interests. I realized that if I was going to protect what remained of my life, I had to treat my marriage with the same clinical precision as a hostile takeover. I stayed silent while the attorney reviewed the foundation's bylaws and the LLC filings I had uncovered. He looked up at me with a grim expression, noting that Claire had been granted signatory authority over accounts I hadn't checked in years. I realized that she hadn't just been moving money. She had been systematically stripping the equity from our shared properties to fund Aurelia's holdings. I stayed silent as he explained the legal implications of her actions. It was a sophisticated form of marital embezzlement, orchestrated with professional help. I realized that Marcus wasn't just my professional rival, he was the architect of my domestic ruin as well. The two of them were betting that my pride would prevent me from taking this to court, that I would accept a quiet settlement to avoid the public humiliation of being cheated on and robbed simultaneously. That was the moment I understood their true miscalculation. They thought I cared about my reputation more than I cared about the truth. I told the attorney to begin the forensic audit, but to keep it completely invisible. We weren't going to sue, we were going to repossess. Returning to the office, I found Marcus standing in my doorway, holding the file that belonged to the Whitaker-Sinclair Trust. He didn't even have the grace to look guilty. "Julian asked me to review these for the transition, Andrew," he said, his tone dripping with a false, youthful empathy. I realized that he was already living in my life, occupying my space, and touching my legacy. I stayed silent because I wanted him to feel the weight of the air in the room. I watched him fidget with the file, his confidence flickering for just a second under my steady gaze. That was the moment I understood that he was over-leveraged. He had promised Julian results that required my cooperation, and he was starting to realize I wasn't going to give it. Section 4. Betrayal is efficient when it's coordinated. The coordination between the office and my home became a symphony of subtle cues. I noticed that Julian and Claire were now frequently at the same events. According to social media tags, Elena Price was carefully leaving like breadcrumbs. I realized that Elena wasn't just a friend. She was the communications officer for this operation, ensuring that the social narrative was being shaped in their favor. They were painting me as a man who had lost his edge, a man who was quietly stepping back because he could no longer handle the volatility of the modern market. I stayed silent during a dinner party where Elena mentioned how hard it must be for a man of my age to keep up with the new algorithmic trading models Marcus was implementing. I realized that the psychological pressure was designed to make me act out, to make me defensive or aggressive. If I shouted, I was unstable. If I protested, I was bitter. So I chose to be nothing. I became a vacuum that absorbed their insults and gave back no reflection. I stayed silent while Marcus described his new vision for the Sinclair accounts at the firm's annual gala, even as Robert Sinclair stood next to me watching Marcus with a look of intense, quiet scrutiny. I realized that Robert was the only one who saw the game I was playing. He caught my eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. That was the moment I understood that the counter move was ready. The trap was set, but it wasn't mine, it was theirs. I noticed a transfer of $40 million from the firm's liquidity pool into a high-risk offshore vehicle managed by Aurelius Holdings. It was a move that bypassed the standard compliance filters because Julian had manually overridden the system. I realized that they were getting greedy. They weren't just building a new firm, they were looting the current one to ensure their new venture started with a massive capital advantage. I stayed silent because I knew that this specific move left a digital trail that no amount of shell companies could hide. I realized that Julian's desperation for a quick exit was making him sloppy, and Marcus's arrogance was making him blind to the oversight triggers I had personally installed years ago. At home, Claire began talking about taking some time apart to find herself in a house she had recently scouted in the Hamptons. I realized that she was preparing to leave before the fallout from the firm's collapse reached her. She wanted the money, but she didn't want the association with the scandal she was helping to create. I stayed silent as she described her need for emotional clarity. I realized that she had no idea I had already frozen the offshore accounts she thought were hers. She was planning a life based on capital that no longer existed in the form she expected. That was the moment I understood that the most efficient betrayal is the one where the betrayer thinks they have already won. As the section closed, I received the notification on my private phone. It was a message from a contact at the SEC, someone I had helped years ago. The message was simple. The audit you requested on Aurelius Holdings has flagged an inconsistency. We are moving to a formal inquiry tomorrow morning. I looked at Claire, who was humming a soft tune while packing a small suitcase for her weekend trip. I realized that she wasn't coming back, and Julian wasn't going to have a firm to go to on Monday. I stayed silent because the collapse was now inevitable, and the only thing left to determine was who would be left standing when the dust settled. I watched her zip the bag, wondering if she had ever truly known me at all. Section 5. I stopped protecting people from consequences. The atmosphere in the office on Monday morning was charged with a frantic, hidden energy. I saw Marcus whispering into his headset, his face pale against the backdrop of the flickering trading terminals. He didn't look like the bold innovator anymore. He looked like a man trying to outrun an avalanche. I realized that the SEC inquiry had hit their servers at dawn, freezing the liquidity of the Aurelius accounts. I stayed silent as I walked to my desk, pouring a cup of black coffee and opening a spreadsheet that had nothing to do with their panic. That was the moment I understood that my greatest weapon wasn't the information I held, but the protection I had decided to withdraw. For years, I had been the one smoothing over Julian's regulatory lapses and Marcus's technical errors. I realized that without my invisible hand steadying the ship, they were finally feeling the full weight of their own incompetence. Julian called an emergency meeting in the glass-walled conference room, but for the first time in a decade, I wasn't invited. I watched through the transparent partition as he paced, gesturing wildly toward a laptop screen. I stayed silent because I knew exactly what he was seeing, a series of access denied prompts on the offshore accounts he had used to hide the firm's capital. I realized that they were looking for a scapegoat, someone to blame for the technical glitch that was actually a legal seizure. But because they had spent months stripping me of my authority and access, they couldn't point the finger at me. I had been transitioned, remember? I was just an advisor now, a man with no hands on the wheel. That was the moment I understood the beauty of the trap they had built for me. It had become their prison. I received a text from Claire at 11:30 a.m. It was short, panicked. "Andrew, there's something wrong with the Foundation's wire transfer. Can you call the bank?" I looked at the phone and felt a strange, detached sense of peace. I stayed silent, letting the phone vibrate on the mahogany desk until it went dark. I realized that she was at the closing for the Hamptons house, expecting the stolen funds to clear, only to find herself standing in front of a real estate lawyer with a frozen account. She wasn't asking for my help because she loved me. She was asking because she still thought I was the safety net she could cut whenever she pleased. I realized that her betrayal was predicated on the idea that I would always be there to fix the world she broke. By mid-afternoon, the rumor mill was in full swing. Word had leaked that the Sinclair Group was pulling its entire $4 billion portfolio from Foster and Associates. I watched Julian's office door fly open as he stormed toward me, his face a shade of purple I had never seen before. "Did you do this?" he hissed, leaning over my desk. I looked up at him, my expression a mask of professional concern. I stayed silent for 5 seconds, a duration that felt like an hour in the middle of a collapsing firm. "Julian," I said calmly, "you told the board I was no longer fit to manage high-stakes relationships. I simply followed your lead and told Robert he should look for management that aligns with the firm's new dynamic direction." I realized that the truth was more devastating than any lie could ever be. Julian's hands were shaking as he realized the implications. Without the Sinclair assets, the firm was technically insolvent. The high-risk bets Marcus had placed were now uncollateralized, triggering a series of margin calls that would wipe out the firm's remaining reserves by the closing bell. I realized that they had bet everything on my silence and my compliance. They thought I would value the firm's survival over my own justice. I stayed silent as he turned and walked back to his office. His shoulders slumped, the weight of 1,000 bad decisions finally crushing his spine. That was the moment I understood that the most powerful thing you can do to a person who has betrayed you is to simply stop standing between them and the reality they created. Section 6. Power returns, quietly through structure. The legal teams began to descend on the office by Tuesday morning. It wasn't the loud, dramatic raid people see in movies. It was a quiet, clinical arrival of men in gray suits carrying encrypted laptops. I sat in my corner office, which suddenly felt like the only stable ground in a sinking city. I realized that the investigators weren't looking at me. They were focused entirely on the unauthorized overrides Julian had used to fund Aurelia's holdings. I stayed silent as I handed over my logs, the ones I had kept since the first day I noticed the money moving. I realized that by documenting their theft without intervening, I hadn't become an accomplice. I had become the star witness for the prosecution. I went home to find Claire sitting in the dark in our living room. The suitcase she had packed for the Hamptons was sitting by the door, still zipped, a monument to a life that had failed to launch. "The bank said the accounts are under federal review, Andrew," she said, her voice trembling. "They mentioned your name." I realized she was looking for a way to blame me for her own greed. I stayed silent as I poured myself a glass of water, not offering her one. I realized that she still didn't understand the scale of what was happening. She thought this was a marital spat, a clever move in a divorce negotiation. She didn't realize that the financial restructuring I had undertaken was a scorched earth policy for anyone involved in the Aurelius LLC. "I didn't know Marcus was using the firm's money," she whispered, a last-ditch effort to claim innocence. I realized that she was willing to throw her lover under the bus the moment the wind changed. I stayed silent because I had the emails. I had the transcripts of the meetings she had attended at Elena's house, where the three of them had discussed how to manage me out of my own life. That was the moment I understood that loyalty wasn't a fixed trait for her. It was a commodity that she traded based on current market value. I realized that my value in her eyes had officially hit zero, and for the first time, I was perfectly comfortable with that. The next day, I met with Robert Sinclair at a quiet club uptown. He was already talking about the new firm we would start together, a lean, private boutique focused on the principles of transparency and long-term stability. "You played it well, Andrew," he said, lighting a cigar. "Most men would have burned the building down with themselves inside." I realized that he saw the strategy for what it was, a managed liquidation of my enemies. I stayed silent for a moment, looking out at the city skyline. I realized that I didn't feel the rush of revenge I had expected. Instead, I felt a deep, quiet sense of order. The market had corrected itself. The bad actors were being delisted, and the capital was returning to where it was respected. As I left the club, I saw Marcus Lane standing on the sidewalk, looking up at the Foster & Associates building. He looked smaller than I remembered, his expensive suit hanging off a frame that seemed to have shrunk overnight. He saw me and started to move toward me, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to beg. I stayed silent and continued walking toward my car, not acknowledging his existence with so much as a glance. I realized that any word I gave him would be a gift he didn't deserve. He was no longer a rival. He was a footnote in a case study on corporate failure. That was the moment I understood that the ultimate form of power isn't control over others. It's the total lack of need for their recognition. I drove back to the house to find a process server waiting at the gate. He handed me a packet of papers. Julian Foster was being sued by the board of directors, and my name was listed as the primary consultant for the recovery of assets. I realized that the very people who had tried to sideline me were now legally obligated to pay me to fix the mess they had made. I stayed silent as I read the documents, a small, cold smile touching my lips. I realized that the restructuring was almost complete. The only thing left was the final moral closure, the moment when the last of the illusions would be stripped away. I went inside and found Claire in the kitchen, staring at a frozen bank statement. I realized the question wasn't what I would do next, but how long I would let her wait for an answer that was never coming. Section 7. They realized, too late, what I controlled. The final board meeting of Foster & Associates didn't take place in the mahogany boardroom. It happened in a sterile, white-walled legal suite, under the hum of fluorescent lights and the watchful eyes of 3 court-appointed monitors. Julian sat across from me, his tie undone, looking like a man who had been awake for 72 hours. Marcus wasn't even there. His lawyer had advised him to stay away to avoid further self-incrimination. I realized that the power dynamic had completely inverted. They were no longer the innovators deciding my fate, they were the defendants, and I was the only one who held the map to the minefield they had walked into. I stayed silent as Julian's attorney pleaded for a coordinated recovery, a polite way of asking me to use my influence to stop the bleeding. I realized that they still thought this was a negotiation. They thought that if they offered me a large enough piece of the remaining carcass, I would help them bury the evidence of their intent. I stayed silent because I wanted them to hear the sound of their own desperation. I realized that Julian had never actually understood the portfolios he was stealing. He didn't know that I had embedded poison pill clauses in the Sinclair contracts, clauses that triggered massive, immediate penalties if the lead manager was changed without a 90-day cooling-off period. That was the moment I understood that their greed had blinded them to the very basics of the contracts they had signed. They hadn't just stolen the business, they had inherited a debt they couldn't pay. "Andrew, we can still fix this," Julian whispered during a break, his voice cracking. "If you talk to Sinclair, if you tell the SEC it was a misunderstanding of the internal ledger, we can preserve the firm's rating." I realized that he was asking me to commit perjury to save his reputation. I stayed silent, looking at him with a level of pity that seemed to disturb him more than anger would have. I realized that men like Julian don't fear losing their souls, they fear losing their status. I told him that the time for fixing had passed during the quarter when he decided to override my compliance filters. I realized that by the time the sun set today, his name would be a cautionary tale in every business school in the country. At home, the walls seemed to be closing in on Claire. Elena Price had stopped calling. The social circle that had been so eager to gossip about my decline had vanished the moment the word federal was attached to our accounts. I realized that Claire was experiencing a different kind of poverty, a social bankruptcy. I stayed silent while she walked through the house, touching the expensive art and the designer furniture as if she were memorizing it for a future she wouldn't inhabit. She asked me if we were going to lose the house. I realized that she was still thinking about the assets, never the betrayal. I told her that the house was technically owned by a trust she had signed over to the Sinclair Group as collateral for a loan she didn't realize Marcus had taken in her name. That was the moment I understood the finality of my structure. I hadn't just protected myself, I had allowed them to use their own deception to trap one another. Marcus had lied to Claire about the safety of the money, and Claire had lied to me about where it was going. I stayed silent because the legal machinery was now doing the work for me. I realized that the silence I had maintained for months was finally paying dividends. I wasn't the one who had taken her home. She had traded it for a dream that Marcus had sold her. I watched her sit on the edge of our bed, her head in her hands, and I realized that I no longer felt the need to offer comfort. The contract of our life together had been breached, and the liquidation was total. Section 8. What remains? When loyalty was mispriced. The morning of the final transition arrived with a cold, clear sky. I stood in the lobby of the new Whitaker Sinclair offices, a space that felt light, modern, and honest. Robert Sinclair was there, shaking hands with the new team professionals I had hand-picked from the wreckage of the old firm, people who valued competence over charisma. I realized that I hadn't just survived, I had evolved. The tired veteran they thought they were sidelining had been replaced by a man who understood that true power doesn't need to shout. I stayed silent as the first trades were executed under the new banner. I realized that the market always finds its level, and so does a man's character. I received one final phone call from Julian. He wasn't calling to threaten me this time. He was calling to ask for a reference for a consulting gig in a smaller market. I stayed silent for a long beat, listening to the static on the line. I realized that he still didn't get it. He thought that after everything, we were still colleagues who had just had a bad run. I told him that I believed in total transparency and that if I were called for a reference, I would provide the full, unedited logs of his time at Foster & Associates. I realized that the truth was the only weapon I ever needed. I hung up the phone and felt a weight lift that I had been carrying since the first quarter. Everything looked normal on paper. The divorce papers were finalized in a quiet office a few weeks later. Claire sat across from me, looking older than her years, the teardrop diamond necklace conspicuously absent. She tried to speak, perhaps to offer a final apology or an explanation for why she had chosen Marcus's ambition over our history. I stayed silent, raising a hand to stop her. I realized that explanations were just another form of currency I no longer accepted. The judgment had already been rendered by the facts. I realized that she wasn't mourning me. She was mourning the lifestyle she had helped destroy. I signed the documents with a steady hand, feeling the finality of the ink as it dried on the page. As I walked out of the lawyer's office, I saw Marcus Lane sitting on a park bench across the street. He looked like a ghost, a man whose future had been traded away for a momentary advantage. He didn't see me, or perhaps he chose not to. I realized that he would spend the rest of his life trying to figure out where the math went wrong. He would never understand that the flaw wasn't in the numbers, but in the people. I stayed silent as I walked past him, my pace even and deliberate. I realized that the most successful trade I had ever made wasn't a stock or a bond. It was the decision to stop valuing people who didn't value me. I drove toward the coast, the city shrinking in my rearview mirror. I realized that the silence I had feared was now my greatest ally. It wasn't the silence of isolation, but the silence of peace. I had restructured my life the way I restructured risk, patiently, legally, and invisibly. I realized that the wealth I had lost was replaceable, but the clarity I had gained was priceless. I stayed silent as I watched the waves hit the shore, a rhythmic reminder that the world continues to move regardless of our betrayals or our victories. I realized that for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was the one who had decided where it landed. I sat on the deck of my new, modest home, looking at a simple ledger on my lap. It showed a modest profit for the first month of the new firm, but more importantly, it showed a clean balance sheet. I realized that the cost of betrayal is always higher than the profit of the crime. I stayed silent as the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the water. I realized that I had won not by fighting, but by refusing to play a rigged game. That was the moment I understood that the ultimate moral victory isn't in seeing others fail, but in knowing that you are the architect of your own integrity. I closed the ledger, and for the first time in a long time, I let the silence be enough. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.